Everyone thought it was just an old basement. But when an elderly woman opened up the wall, the house breathed for the first time in 120 years. What she found inside prompted her to call the FBI. See why this discovery rewrote history. Subscribe and write in the comments which city you are from. The train rattled to its final stop at the edge of Norwich, a small coastal town where the air always seemed to taste faintly of salt and rain. When Evelyn Moore stepped down from the platform, clutching her old leather satchel and the folded deed in her gloved hand, she looked less like a woman returning home and more like one stepping quietly into someone else's memory. The wind came off the sea, tugging at her hair and coat, carrying with it the muffled hiss of waves breaking against the cliffs below. Somewhere behind the station, a bell chimed the hour, slow and uncertain, as if unsure whether anyone was still listening. The house waited on the hill above the town, half hidden behind a row of skeletal elms. The cab driver who took her there seemed reluctant to go all the way up the winding path. "No one's lived there since before my father's time," he said, eyes fixed on the mirror. "Belonged to one of the Moores, I think. Strange folks. Builders, maybe. Or scholars. Hard to say now." Evelyn smiled faintly and told him she knew. The driver said nothing more. When the car stopped before the iron gate, the sound of the engine died, leaving only the whisper of the sea and the creak of metal as she pushed the gate open. The house was larger than she had imagined. Weather-beaten clapboards peeled in long curls, and the porch sagged under its own age. Yet there was a stubborn grace to it, a sense of endurance, as if the building itself had waited for her. Moss clung to the stones, and vines, long dead from winter, hung like faded ribbons around the eaves. A single shutter banged lazily against the upper window, moved by the steady wind. Evelyn stood there for a long moment, her hand resting on the gatepost, feeling the cold seep into her skin. She had not expected to inherit anything at all. The letter from a law firm in Boston had come without ceremony, a single page informing her that a distant cousin, one she barely remembered, had left her this property in recognition of family continuity. She unlocked the front door, and the hinges groaned in protest. Dust motes spiraled in the dim light as she stepped inside. The air smelled of damp wood, iron, and the faint sweetness of something long closed away. The hallway stretched forward into shadow, the floorboards creaking beneath her shoes. A thin layer of dust covered everything. Chairs with turned legs, a heavy oak table, and a tall mirror that reflected her faintly distorted image. The house felt neither welcoming nor hostile. It felt aware. In the kitchen, she found relics of another life, a cracked teapot, a rusted tin of nails, a child's marble scattered across a shelf. She touched them all with the gentle curiosity of a teacher examining artifacts. Then, on the far counter, she discovered an old roll of parchment, folded carefully inside a tin box. When she unrolled it, she saw that it was a floor plan of the house, drawn by hand. The lines were precise, each room labeled in faded ink. But what caught her attention was a small circle drawn beneath the staircase, down where the cellar should be. Someone had marked it twice, as though to ensure it would not be overlooked. She stared at that circle for a long time, the faint tremor of intrigue creeping into her chest. It was easy to dismiss such things as quirks of old builders, perhaps a storage alcove, a forgotten drain, nothing more. But she felt a quiet tug of curiosity. She folded the map and slipped it into her coat pocket. Later, she told herself. She would look later. That evening, as the sun sank behind the sea, the house filled with the color of rust and fading gold. Evelyn unpacked her few belongings, lit a lamp, and sat near the hearth with a cup of tea gone cold. The floor above her sighed from time to time, the slow settling of beams and joists. But beneath it all, there was another rhythm, softer, steady, like the distant sound of a heartbeat. She told herself it was the wind moving through the chimney, yet when she listened closely, it seemed to rise and fall in a way too deliberate for chance. It had been 2 years since her husband died. In that time, silence had become her most loyal companion. She had left her teaching post quietly, telling her colleagues she needed time to think, though in truth, she no longer knew what to do with time at all. Her children lived far away, one in Oregon, another in London, and called only out of obligation. The house, for all its strangeness, gave her purpose. She could clean it, restore it, occupy it, and in doing so, perhaps restore something in herself. The following morning, she began to work. She opened every window to let in the sharp, clean air. She washed the grime from the walls, dusted the shelves, polished the glass of the front door until it caught the light again. Beneath the layers of dust, she found beauty. The dark gleam of oak panels, the careful craftsmanship of banisters carved with simple floral patterns. Whoever had built the house had done so with devotion, not haste. Days passed this way, quiet and methodical. She learned the rhythms of the place, how the wind hummed in the eaves at dawn, how the boards in the hallway clicked after sunset, how the shadows shifted across the parlor walls. Yet there was one sound she could not account for. Each night, sometime after midnight, a faint tapping echoed from below. Slow, irregular, as though someone knocked lightly from the other side of the floor. The first time she heard it, she froze, listening. The second night, she tried to ignore it. By the third, she rose from bed, wrapped herself in a shawl, and went down to the first floor. But when she stood in the hallway, the sound stopped, leaving only silence and her own heartbeat. Curiosity, she reminded herself, is a dangerous thing. She had spent her career teaching that every story hides a lesson, but life had taught her that some lessons are better left unread. Still, as she descended the stairs to the basement door a few days later, she knew she would not resist. The cellar door was heavier than she expected. The key, long rusted, resisted her hand. When it finally turned, the smell of cold earth rose to meet her. She found a lantern on a hook, lit it, and stepped into the gloom. The ceiling was low, the air thick with the scent of damp mortar and thyme. Shelves lined the walls, covered in dust and cobwebs, and there, at the far end, half hidden behind old crates and a broken chair, she saw the arch. It was built of darker bricks than the rest, uneven, with traces of metal embedded between them. The shape was deliberate, not part of the foundation but added later, like a doorway that had been sealed. She moved closer, running her gloved hand along the rough surface. The bricks were cold, smoother toward the center, as though touched many times before being covered. Evelyn's breath caught. The lantern's flame quivered, casting trembling light across the arch. It was beautiful in a strange, unsettling way, something that felt older than the rest of the house, purposeful, secret. She tapped one brick gently with the handle of her lantern, and a hollow echo answered her. The sound was faint but clear, a space beyond. For a long moment she stood there, the silence pressing around her like water. She imagined what might lie behind that wall, a forgotten storage room, perhaps, or an old coal chute. Nothing remarkable. And yet, as she stood in that cold, shadowed space, she felt certain the house itself was watching, waiting. The tapping she had heard at night no longer seemed random. It felt like a pulse. When she returned upstairs, the daylight had thinned to a dull gray. She closed the cellar door and leaned against it, her heart still beating too fast. The map in her pocket weighed heavily, as if reminding her that curiosity was not an accident, but a summons. In the parlor mirror, her reflection looked different. Eyes sharper, mouth set in quiet resolve. The house, she thought, wanted to be known. That night, as the tide came in and the wind sighed through the elm branches, Evelyn lay awake, listening to the creaks and groans of the structure settling into sleep. Somewhere deep below, beneath layers of brick and time, she imagined the faint whisper of air moving through the sealed archway, a breath that had waited more than 100 years for release. She turned onto her side, closed her eyes, and felt a strange peace settle over her. Whatever the secret was, it was hers now. The house had chosen her, and she, though she did not yet know it, had already begun to answer. The following days passed in a quiet rhythm that felt almost suspended outside of time. Morning light seeped through the tall windows of the old house, painting long bars across the floor. Evelyn rose early, tidied the rooms, and tried to ignore the thought of the sealed archway waiting beneath her feet. Yet even as she brewed her coffee or brushed the dust from the stair rails, her mind returned again and again to that hollow sound she had heard when she tapped the brick. Something about it lingered, like a word half-remembered, hovering on the edge of meaning. She told herself that she had come here to live out her remaining years peacefully, perhaps to find a measure of purpose after the long stretch of grief that had followed her husband's death. But peace, she was learning, had its own kind of restlessness. It whispered in quiet corners, urging her to notice what she had overlooked. And so, every day, as she passed the cellar door, she paused just for a moment, listening. The sound came again on the third night. She woke to the house breathing boards creaking, windows rattling softly in their frames, and then that faint, deliberate tapping from below. Not loud enough to startle her, but steady, as if in rhythm with her own heartbeat. She sat up in bed, her pulse quickened, and whispered into the dark, "Who's there?" But there was no answer, only the long sigh of the wind curling through the chimney. When morning came, she decided it was time. It was a day of low clouds and slow rain. The garden outside glistened with droplets that clung to the grass like small pieces of glass. Evelyn found a hammer, a chisel, and an old work light in the shed behind the house. She felt slightly ridiculous carrying them through the parlor, but determination steadied her hands. The cellar was cold when she entered, and her breath hung in faint clouds. She set the lantern on a crate, its light cutting narrow beams through the dust, and stood before the archway. The dark curve of brick seemed to absorb the glow. Her first strike echoed like thunder in a cave. Dust rained down in thin streams, coating her sleeves and hair. She struck again, harder, and a small fragment of mortar fell away. Beneath it, the brick was smoother than she had expected, faintly discolored, as though sealed in haste. Each swing sent vibrations through the room until she felt them in her bones. And then, after nearly an hour, a small piece broke loose and rolled to her feet. From the gap it left came a faint exhale of air, so cold and dry that it made her eyes water. She set the tools aside and crouched, holding her palm near the opening. A whisper of air brushed her skin, neither warm nor cold, but heavy, as if it had lain undisturbed for a century. Her heart pounded. What could possibly have been hidden for so long? She stepped back, brushing the dust from her coat, and told herself she would stop. The wall was old. It could collapse. But as she turned to leave, she heard the faintest sound again, a hollow, empty sigh from the space beyond, and knew she wouldn't sleep if she stopped now. Hour after hour passed. The bricks were stubborn, bound together by layers of hardened mortar mixed with fine grit and iron flakes. Whoever sealed this had wanted it to last forever. Yet Evelyn was equally stubborn. Sweat ran down her neck, stinging her eyes, but she kept going until her arms ached, and the chisel handle left bruises on her palms. When at last the wall gave way enough for her to peer through, she froze. At first, all she saw was darkness. Then, as she adjusted the lantern, the beam cut across a narrow space beyond a small chamber barely wider than a closet. Inside was a table coated in dust, so thick it looked like snow. A single chair leaned against the far wall, one leg mended crudely with wire. Shelves sagged beneath the weight of jars, books, and rolled papers, all ghostly pale under the film of time. Against one wall hung a framed portrait. The painted eyes, gray and sharp, seemed to meet hers through the decades. Evelyn climbed carefully through the broken arch. The air was dense, metallic, tasting faintly of rust and oil. Each step stirred small clouds of dust that danced in the lantern light. She set the lamp on the table and brushed a line across its surface, revealing the dark oak beneath. The craftsmanship was fine, old, deliberate. This was no storage cellar. Whoever built this had cared deeply for what it contained. Her gaze drifted to the shelves. The jars held strange contents. Liquids turned amber with age, dried herbs, fragments of paper floating like ghosts. The books were bound in cracked leather, their spines faintly embossed with gold lettering too worn to read. One had collapsed open, its pages curled at the edges like old leaves. Beneath the table lay a small wooden box bound with string. On its lid, in faded ink, she saw a handwritten label. To be opened only by one who bears the name, Moore. Her breath caught. The surname on the deed, the same that belonged to her own family. She sank onto the chair, the dust puffing up around her like smoke, and stared at the box. It was as if the house had been waiting not just for anyone, but for her specifically. Her hands trembled as she reached for it, then stopped. Some part of her knew that opening it would change everything. She set it gently aside, promising herself she would open it, only after understanding the rest. She turned to the portrait on the wall. The man's face was solemn but kind, the lines around his mouth softened by an expression of quiet fatigue. One hand rested on a book, the other held a carpenter's square. Beneath the frame, half hidden under grime, she could make out the faint glimmer of a brass plaque. She wiped it clean with her sleeve until the inscription appeared. For those the world would not see. Evelyn stepped back. Her chest tightened. The words carried a weight that felt personal, though she did not yet know why. She looked again at the initials scrawled in the corner of the blueprint she had found upstairs. GM, and whispered the connection aloud. G for George? Gregory? No. Perhaps Henry? She frowned, realizing that her grandmother's maiden name had been Moore as well, and her father once spoke of an ancestor who built homes along the coast. Could this man be him? That night, she could not sleep. The images of the hidden room haunted her. The books, the jars, the dust-covered table. She lit a candle and sat by the window, watching the flicker of the flame reflected in the glass. The sea below was invisible, but she could hear it breathing, steady and eternal. The house creaked softly around her, no longer hostile but alive, as though relieved that its secret had been seen. In the morning, she returned to the cellar armed with gloves and a notebook. The sunlight through the small window illuminated motes of dust that floated like tiny constellations. She spent hours cataloging what she found, handling each object with care. The papers were fragile, their ink faded, but still legible in places. There were lists of names written in a firm hand, each one followed by a note. Arrived safely, gone north, unknown. Others were more cryptic. Taken, walls sealed. God help us. Beneath the lists lay maps, hand-drawn layouts of the town and surrounding countryside. Several houses were circled in red ink, their locations connected by lines that seemed to form a pattern. At the bottom of one map, faint but clear, was a phrase written in cursive: Houses of Refuge. Evelyn's pulse quickened. She had heard that term once, long ago, in a documentary about secret networks during times of persecution. The idea that her ancestor could have been part of such a thing seemed impossible, yet the evidence was there before her, preserved beneath her own home. In one of the books, she found pages filled with short phrases alternating between English and Latin. Domus memoriam servat, quod mundus obliviscitur. A house must remember what the world forgets. The words were written repeatedly, as though by someone trying to make them endure. Beneath them, in a trembling hand, was a note. If this place is ever found, let the one who discovers it understand that walls are built not only to keep danger out, but to keep truth in. She closed the book slowly. The air in the small chamber felt different now, heavier, but not suffocating. It was as if the walls themselves were exhaling the stories they had held for a century. Her eyes fell on the portrait again, and she felt certain that the man within it, her ancestor, had built this space not as a prison, but as a sanctuary. Perhaps for those fleeing something terrible, perhaps for ideas forbidden to speak aloud. When she finally climbed back upstairs, the afternoon light had turned amber, and dust clung to her hair and clothes. She washed her hands in the kitchen sink, watching the water turn gray and swirl down the drain. The smell of the cellar lingered on her skin, earthy, metallic, tinged with oil and something ancient. She set the notebook on the table and poured herself tea, though she barely tasted it. Her mind was too full of voices that no longer had bodies. As dusk fell, she looked again at the wooden box resting beside her. The string had loosened slightly, the label curling at its edges. She traced the letters of her family name with her fingertip, feeling both awe and fear. She did not open it that night. Some instinct told her the time was not right, that whatever waited inside deserved a witness, not mere curiosity. Later, lying in bed, she listened to the house. The wind moved through the elms like soft breathing. Somewhere below, a slow rhythmic tapping began again, steady, deliberate, the sound of something deep within the structure acknowledging her discovery. But this time, she did not feel afraid. The house was not warning her. It was speaking in the only language it knew. She whispered into the darkness, "I hear you." For the first time in years, she dreamed vividly. In her dream, the walls of the house glowed faintly with light from within, as though lit by candles sealed behind the plaster. She saw the face of the man from the portrait, laying bricks one by one, his hand steady, his expression solemn. When he placed the last brick, he looked up, not at her, but through her, and whispered something she could not understand. Then he stepped back into the shadow, and the wall closed over him. She woke with tears on her cheeks, and the echo of his voice, lingering like the sea wind at dawn. Morning came gray and cold. The first thing she did was write everything down, the details of the hidden room, the inscriptions, the maps, the lists of names. It was no longer enough to simply discover. She needed to understand. As she wrote, she noticed the sunlight strike the framed photograph of her husband on the mantel. It reminded her of something he once said, that memory is the only true inheritance we ever leave behind. The thought filled her with quiet determination. When she returned to the cellar, she knelt beside the arch and looked through the gap she had made. The light inside was softer now, almost gentle. Dust drifted lazily through the air like smoke after a fire. She could still smell the faint scent of paper and oil. For the first time since she had arrived at the house, she felt not like an intruder, but a keeper. Whatever this place was, it had chosen her to open it and to remember. That night, as the tide rose again and the first stars appeared above the water, Evelyn sat at her desk by the window, her notebook open, the wooden box before her. The label seemed to glow faintly in the lamplight, the letters of her family name alive with dust and time. She touched the string, but did not untie it. Instead, she whispered softly, as though speaking to the house itself. "I'll find the truth, I promise." Outside, the wind shifted, rustling through the elms. Somewhere beneath the floorboards, the faint tapping came once more, not as a warning now, but as an answer. The sound spread through the quiet rooms, like a heartbeat returning after a long sleep, steady and patient, as if the past had begun to breathe again. The days that followed were a blur of research, dust, and cautious wonder. The discovery of the hidden room had changed everything. It no longer felt like Evelyn was merely living in the house. It felt as though she were sharing it with the echo of another mind, one that still murmured from within the walls. The whisper of the sea beyond the windows, mixed with the creaks and groans of the beams. And sometimes she imagined the building itself, breathing softly, relieved at last to have its story uncovered. Yet, alongside her growing curiosity, came a new unease. She could not escape the sense that by opening the archway, she had crossed into a history that others might not want remembered. It began with the letters. She spent entire afternoons in the cellar, reading them by the thin beam of her lantern. The ink was faded, but legible, written in the careful, elegant script of another age. Some were addressed to Mr. H. Moore, architect, and bore postmarks from cities across the coast. Others were unsigned, written in haste on cheap paper, their language restrained, but urgent. Words like safe passage, refuge, and confiscation appeared again and again, and always, near the end, the same phrase: "For those the world will not see." Each time she read it, she felt a quiet chill, as if the message was meant not only for the past, but for her as well. Unable to bear the weight of her ignorance any longer, Evelyn decided to seek help. The morning she left for the university was cold and overcast. She took the train inland to meet Dr. Clara Watson, a young historian she had once seen interviewed on television about forgotten communities and hidden histories. Clara greeted her in a modest office lined with books and stacks of papers. When Evelyn unfolded the yellow documents across the desk, the young woman's expression shifted from polite interest to stunned concentration. For a long moment, she said nothing, only traced her finger along the faded handwriting. Then she whispered, "These can't be fakes. The paper, the ink, the phrasing, they're early 20th century." Over tea, Evelyn explained everything. The inheritance, the house, the sealed arch, the portrait, the box she still hadn't dared to open. Clara listened carefully, her expression a mixture of curiosity and disbelief that slowly gave way to awe. She promised to help verify the authenticity of the documents and offered to cross-check the names in local archives. By the end of their meeting, Evelyn felt something she hadn't felt in years. Hope. Not the fragile hope of grief, but the solid, working kind that comes with purpose. Within a week, Clara wrote back with her first findings. The names on the lists corresponded to individuals who had vanished from public records between 1901 and 1910, factory workers, laborers, immigrants, and families who had been documented in census reports only to disappear the following year. There were even notes of police raids and cleansings in newspapers of that era, events later erased from official accounts. The deeper Clara dug, the clearer the pattern became. The man from the portrait, Henry Moore, had built not just homes, but sanctuaries. He had been an architect by trade, but his blueprints contained modifications never approved by his clients: hidden cellars, false walls, concealed staircases. He was part of an underground network that helped families flee persecution during one of the ugliest chapters in local history, when certain groups were targeted by both law and mob for being unfit settlers. When the network was uncovered, many of its participants were imprisoned or executed. The record of Henry Moore's death was brief and brutal. Found drowned near the riverbank. No investigation pursued. Evelyn sat by the window reading the letter, her hands trembling. The sea outside was a dull pewter, the waves dark and heavy beneath the gray sky. She imagined Henry, her ancestor, building this house not as a place to live, but as a fortress of compassion. And then she thought of the brass plaque in the hidden room. For those the world would not see, and understood its meaning for the first time, that night she couldn't sleep. Each gust of wind against the windows reminded her of how easily silence can be imposed on the living. She lit a candle and returned to the cellar, drawn as if by instinct. There, she unsealed the wooden box she had avoided for weeks. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, were letters tied together with a faded ribbon. The first was addressed simply to the one who carries my name. It was signed, Henry Moore, 1905. His words were calm, almost tender. He described his work, his fear of discovery, his wish that one day someone might understand. "They will call me traitor," he wrote, "but I could not be loyal to cruelty. If my house still stands when you find this, it means mercy has outlived hatred. Tell them I did what I could. Tell them I believed walls could shelter truth until the world was ready." Evelyn folded the letter back into the box and wept quietly, her tears falling onto the dusty table. When she showed Clara the next day, the young historian's reaction was both joy and dread. "This isn't just a personal story," she said. "It's evidence. You could change what we know about this region's history." Together, they decided to prepare a public exhibit, a modest one at first, using photographs of the documents and a detailed account of the discovery. Clara arranged for the university to host a presentation titled "The Houses of Refuge, a Forgotten Network." The day of the presentation arrived with nervous anticipation. The lecture hall filled quickly. Reporters, local officials, and curious residents came, drawn by the whisper of scandal and history. Evelyn sat quietly in the front row, while Clara spoke about the hidden architecture of compassion, the courage of ordinary people who risked everything to help others. She ended with a photograph of the brass plaque from the cellar wall, and for a long moment, the room was utterly silent. Then came the applause, restrained but sincere. In the days that followed, news spread faster than Evelyn could have imagined. Articles appeared online and in print. Some hailed the discovery as a revelation. Others questioned its authenticity, accusing her of fabrication or attention-seeking. Anonymous letters arrived in her mailbox, at first harmless, merely skeptical, then gradually darker. "Stop digging up ghosts. Let the dead rest." One morning, she found a dead sparrow on her porch, its wings folded neatly. She took it as a warning. Clara tried to reassure her. "It's just noise," she said over the phone. "History always threatens those who depend on forgetting." But Evelyn knew better. The names Clara had uncovered included families tied to powerful descendants still living in the region. Businessmen, politicians, even law enforcement officials. To them, the revival of this history was not merely inconvenient, it was dangerous. One night, the danger became real. Evelyn awoke to the acrid smell of smoke. The porch outside her bedroom window glowed orange, flames licking up the railing. She rushed for a blanket, smothering the fire before it spread, coughing through the smoke. When the firefighters arrived, they found the remains of a glass bottle near the steps. "Someone tossed it from the road," one of them muttered. "Kids, probably." But Evelyn knew it wasn't children. The message had been sent. For several days afterward, she considered giving up. She thought about sealing the arch again, burning the papers, pretending none of it had happened. But every time she looked at the portrait of Henry Moore, she felt his quiet, watchful gaze, reminding her that silence was the enemy. He had died for truth. She could at least live for it. She returned to the cellar, now cleared and organized like a small archive. The jars gleamed under the lamplight, the books neatly stacked. On the table lay the digital camera Clara had brought earlier, its memory card filled with high-resolution images of every document. "Even if they destroy the originals," Clara had said, "the record will survive." Evelyn smiled at the thought, realizing that the house itself had once served that very purpose, to hide the truth until it could be seen. The exhibition opened a week later at the town museum. The night before, Evelyn stood before the display cases, studying the photographs and transcriptions. She had written a brief note to accompany the first letter, explaining her discovery. It ended simply. "We remember not to accuse, but to restore what time tried to erase." Visitors filled the museum that morning. Old couples, students, journalists, all wandering through the narrow aisles, reading the words of the long-dead architect who had defied his time. When Clara introduced Evelyn to the crowd, the applause was loud enough to make her blush. But beneath the pride, a chill of unease crept through her. Near the back of the room, two men in dark coats watched without smiling. When she looked again, they were gone. That night, as she returned home, she found her front door slightly ajar. Nothing appeared stolen, but the hidden room below had been disturbed. The lantern was overturned, the books scattered. The box with Henry's letters lay open, empty. Panic surged through her, followed by a grim calm. She searched the house, finding nothing else touched, then sat at the kitchen table until dawn, staring at the brass key in her hand. The next morning brought worse news. The museum had been broken into, the display cases shattered, photographs torn, computers wiped clean. The director called Evelyn in tears. "They took everything, even the drives. I'm so sorry." But Clara, always practical, appeared at her door later that day with a faint, triumphant smile. "They didn't know about the backups," she said, holding up a small flash drive. "Every image, every word, it's all safe. They can't erase it anymore." Evelyn took the drive, her hands trembling. Relief flooded through her, followed by a deep, steady determination. The same pulse she had once heard behind the bricks now beat in her own chest. They had silenced Henry once, burned his papers, branded him a traitor. But this time, the truth had escaped the walls. It had entered the light. That evening, she sat at her desk, watching the sea darken beyond the window. The waves rose and fell in slow rhythm, the same rhythm she had once heard through the floorboards. She thought of the generations between her and Henry, the years of silence, and how one woman's curiosity had finally cracked the seal. She whispered to the house, as she had done so many nights before. "We're not done yet." The floor creaked softly, almost like a sigh. For the first time, Evelyn felt no fear at all. She felt companionship, the shared breath of those who had come before her and those who would come after. The house was no longer a place of secrets, but of memory. And though the world might still try to bury it, she now knew that memory, once awakened, could never truly die. The storm that had shaken her life for months finally began to calm. In the weeks that followed the museum break-in, the truth refused to die. The small flash drive that Clara had saved became the seed of resurrection. The files were copied, shared, and uploaded by sympathetic colleagues until no act of destruction could reach them again. Historians from the capital contacted Evelyn to verify the discovery. Universities offered grants for preservation. Even skeptical newspapers printed cautious headlines about the architect of mercy. The town that had once regarded her house as a haunted relic now spoke its name with reverence. What had been rumor became recognition, and recognition became remembrance. The officials came first, men and women with clipboards and gentle voices, surveying the old home with a mix of awe and apprehension. They took photographs, measured beams, examined the sealed arch, and finally declared the property a protected landmark. A bronze plaque was placed at the gate that read, "The Moore House of Refuge, 1899, Boissy-en-Wettim-Fèvre." Evelyn stood by as they drilled it into the stone, her heart swelling with a strange, quiet pride. It was not triumph she felt, but relief. The relief of something finally unburied. Reporters came next, drawn by the story of the retired schoolteacher who had uncovered her family's hidden legacy. They asked polite questions about her emotions, about courage and destiny, about what it felt like to restore a hero to history. She answered softly, deflecting the word hero. "He was only a man who did what conscience demanded," she said, "and I was only the one who listened when the house whispered." But the cameras loved her humility, and soon her face appeared in papers across the coast. Amid all the attention, the house began to change. The restoration team, funded by the university and local government, worked carefully under Evelyn's supervision. She refused to let them sterilize its soul. Every plank, every creak, every nail that held the walls together had meaning. She watched them polish the oak banisters, patch the cracks, and clean the cellar without removing its spirit of secrecy. The air remained cool and faintly metallic, as though still breathing the memory of those who had once hidden within. Clara visited often, now more a friend than a colleague. Together, they planned the transformation. The first floor would serve as a small museum, displaying digital replicas of the documents and the story of the refuge network. The cellar, protected by glass, would remain untouched, a preserved chamber of truth. The two women spent long evenings at the kitchen table, surrounded by blueprints, grant forms, and mugs of tea gone cold. They laughed sometimes, surprised by the simple joy of shared purpose. The ghosts of history had become companions rather than burdens. When the day of the museum's opening came, the house seemed to glow from within. Soft lights illuminated the hallway, and the scent of polished wood mixed with the salt air drifting through open windows. People filled the rooms, students, families, tourists, and old townsfolk who had once whispered warnings about the place. Evelyn moved among them quietly, answering questions, guiding them toward the cellar stairs. The moment they saw the preserved chamber through the glass, a hush fell over the crowd. The brass plaque on the far wall caught the light. For those the world would not see. Some wept, others simply stood in silence. A young girl pressed her hand against the glass and whispered, "He was brave." Evelyn smiled, tears stinging her eyes. "Yes," she said softly, "and so were the ones he saved." For a fleeting instant, she felt that Henry himself stood beside her, his presence warm and steady. The house that had once guarded its story in darkness now shone with a living light, and she could almost hear it sigh with contentment. After the ceremony, the guests drifted away, their footsteps echoing on the wooden floors. The night deepened, and the sea outside shimmered with reflected moonlight. Clara remained behind, helping Evelyn stack chairs and tidy pamphlets. When the last of the lights were dimmed, The two women stood in the doorway, gazing out at the plaque, gleaming faintly in the lamplight. "He would be proud," Clara said. "Not of the recognition, but of you." Evelyn shook her head. "He'd say the house did all the work. I just listened." When Clara left, Evelyn lingered in the parlor. The house was quiet again, but it was a different kind of quiet. Alive, peaceful, content. She could hear the faint hum of the heating vents and the distant rhythm of the sea. The air felt neither heavy nor haunted now, only full of memory. She poured herself a cup of tea and sat by the window, where the moonlight painted silver patterns across the floor. As the weeks passed, the museum drew visitors from far beyond Norwich. School buses lined the road. Journalists wrote about a testament to moral courage hidden in plain sight. Evelyn became the reluctant caretaker of something larger than herself. Every morning she opened the doors, greeted the guests, and told the story anew. Yet each retelling felt different, not rehearsed, but evolving. She spoke of Henry not as legend, but as a man who built hope with his hands. She reminded children that history was not a distant echo, but a living inheritance, fragile and dependent on those willing to remember. On quiet afternoons, she would sit in the cellar alone, beyond the glass, surrounded by the faint smell of wood and dust. Sometimes she spoke aloud, unsure whether to Henry, to the house, or to the silence itself. "You were right," she would murmur. "Walls can keep truth safe, but only until someone has the courage to open them." The wind through the small window above would stir slightly, as if answering. The people of Norwich changed, too. Where once they avoided the hill, they now climbed it on weekends, bringing flowers and children. Local craftsmen offered to mend the fence, volunteers tended the overgrown garden, and artists left small sketches at the gate. One elderly man arrived with a letter in trembling hands, a family record proving his grandparents had once lived in a house marked on Henry's maps. He stood in tears before the plaque, whispering, "He saved them." Evelyn placed a hand on his shoulder and said only, "Then you are his legacy." Months slipped into seasons. The sea turned from gray to blue. The elms regained their leaves, and sunlight streamed through the windows in long, golden paths. The house had ceased to be merely her home. It was a living archive of compassion. Each evening, after locking the doors, she would light a single candle in the parlor and let it burn until she went to bed, a quiet ritual of gratitude. Yet even amid peace, she sometimes felt the pull of the past. In her dreams, she still saw Henry at his table, pen in hand, writing by lamplight as the walls closed around him. But now he was not alone. She was there, too, sitting across from him, her own notebook open, recording what he could not finish. When she woke, she always felt lighter, as though some invisible thread between them had grown stronger. One autumn evening, long after the tourists had gone for the year, she invited the local schoolchildren for a storytelling session. They gathered around the cellar glass while she told them of courage and kindness. When she finished, a small boy asked, "Did the house really keep a secret all that time?" Evelyn smiled. "Yes," she said, "but only because no one was ready to hear it. Houses are like people. They hold on to what matters until someone listens." The children nodded solemnly, and she knew they understood more than most adults ever would. As winter approached, the cold returned to the stones, and the wind howled through the chimney as it had in those first lonely nights. But the sound no longer unnerved her. It was the heartbeat of the place, steady and reassuring. On the anniversary of the discovery, she stood alone in the cellar with a candle, its flame reflected in the glass that separated her from the preserved room. The brass plaque gleamed faintly. "For those the world would not see," she read aloud. Then she added, "But we see you now." She felt a sudden warmth, a pulse of air, as though the room itself exhaled. The flame flickered, then steadied. It was not imagination. She knew it. The house, once burdened by silence, was now breathing light. She smiled through tears, whispering, "Rest, Henry. You are remembered." That night, as snow began to fall outside, Evelyn wrote a final entry in her journal. There are two kinds of inheritance, the kind that fills pockets and the kind that fills hearts. One fades, the other endures. I have received the latter. She closed the notebook, placed it on the shelf beside Henry's copied letters, and turned out the lamp. The next morning dawned clear and bright. The sea glittered like glass beneath the rising sun, and the house glowed in the light, its windows alive with reflection. From the path below, a group of visitors approached slowly, their breath misting in the cold air. As Evelyn opened the door to welcome them, she paused for a moment on the threshold, listening. Somewhere deep within the walls, a faint, rhythmic sound echoed, not the creak of old timber, but the steady beat of something alive. She smiled, knowing it for what it was. The house was breathing still, not with fear or secrecy, but with peace. By the afternoon, when the last guests had gone, the rooms were quiet once more. Evelyn sat by the fire, watching the shadows dance along the walls. The light flickered across the framed portrait of Henry Moore, and for an instant, she thought she saw his expression change, no longer weary, but at ease. She closed her eyes, letting the warmth wash over her. The story was complete. Outside, the plaque on the gate caught the dying rays of the sun. The letters gleamed like fire, the House of Light. The wind off the sea rose gently, carrying the sound of distant bells from the town below. And within those walls, filled with the memory of compassion and truth, the silence at last became what it had always wanted to be, not emptiness, but peace. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss the next one. Watch the other stories waiting for you here, and share this video with someone who believes that truth and kindness never fade.